art and literature has the power to deal with human traumas and difficult human conditions. Uh, Before we begin, our student Ifra Ishaq, she has prepared a small clip on Dr. Rizwan Akhtar's poetry and other things. So I would like uh, Ifra to please start that small clip, and then we can start our program. So Ifra.
Welcome to the event BAITHAK, a webinar with Rizwan Akhtar. Today we are here to discuss how to seek help from poetry to fight times. Let's get to know, in words of Rizwan Akhtar, what makes poetry happen. What was that moment of epiphany for him?
Okay, almost 2.5 decades back when I was exploring poets, I would say world poets, both from this part of the world and, the north, and also reading poetry in classroom, I came across this poem by W.H. Auden, which many of us have read, and in which Auden famously says that poetry makes nothing happen. I think it was a moment of some sort of epiphany for me, also one who was just, making a foray into the world of poetry and who was still naive and vulnerable in many ways, that I thought, oh yes, how rightly Auden has said that it makes nothing happen. Because often we associate things happening with some sort of a concrete, visible contribution, a change in the more materialist sense, which unfortunately perhaps art or poetry does not bring, immediately. It takes time sometimes. But then what makes poetry happen is something that is precious, that is entrancing and valuable and long-lasting, and not something that is popular or transient, but something that actually fertilizes your soul and the collective consciousness of the humanity. But for me, this happens through language. So what is more important for me as a writer from this part of the world, where people use language, a lot in their private conversations and in their public conversation, where language is often exaggerated and rhetoricized, and we all often go out of context, you see. I think for me, the poetry is definitely is a sheer player of language. So instead of being driven by ideology first, and other things that is happening in your background. I think for me, it's the word actually that propels poem. It's the word that provokes you to write and to say things, you see. And eventually, I think that in Pakistan, you see, where what I see is that English language poetry scene is still a scene I would call rather elliptical or reluctant, and we don't see many young people coming to poetry.
This year, Rizwan Akhtar got featured in a prestigious international journal. Editor Scottish Pen says, Rizwan imbibed Urdu and Persian literature and was reluctant to be a faddish post-colonial exponent and a defender of the indigenous. Rather, he went to poetry for the sheer pleasure of language. In addition, Dr. Amina Said commented on Akhtar's work by saying, Akhtar's poetry, above all, is the poetry of general rights of humanity, which unmasks the obscure as well as overt challenges fostered under the popular tag of development and the guise of new colonialism. Also, Asma Mansoor commented, Akhtar's work reflects how sights, sounds, and smells all synchronize to establish a vibrant material syntax of the world, which the human mind processes to create new combinations of meanings that allow one to reread oneself in terms of one's individual self as embeddedness within an articulate material world. Thank you for being with us today.
Uh, Thank you, Ifra. Thank you very much. To begin with the program, I would like to invite Dr. Shamila Dodhy. She is the incumbent director of Institute of English Studies. She has done her PhD from uh, University of Putrajaya, Malaysia, and she has worked on trauma, uh, trauma studies happens to be her main area of interest. I would like her to welcome the honorable guest and say a few words about Rizwan's poetry. Thank you. Dr. Shmaila Dodhy.
Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening to all of you and of course those people who are sitting abroad for them the times are different but for the people who are sitting in Pakistan it's evening 5 o'clock. So on the behalf of the Institute of English Studies I welcome all of you, the guests who are from abroad and the guests who are from Pakistan. Recently, just as Dr. Khurshid Alam has talked about, that we have had seen pandemic, and the times of pandemic were very difficult times, not only for us but for the whole world. We have seen severe lockdowns. We have seen so many deaths around us, and then the borders got closed. Everything from schools, colleges, and universities, everything came to a dead end. And there was a time when all of us started thinking that probably it's the time when the world will end. And then the nature took a change, and we see that now, slowly, we are moving towards normalization, and things are changing. Schools, colleges, and universities are opening, factories and routine jobs have already opened. So, we are happy that now we are reverting back to the normal life. As far as poetry is concerned, poetry not only encourages critical thinking skills, but it also helps in healing emotional pain also. That's why we have decided, the Institute of English Studies has decided to call this webinar so that why? Because poetry describes the indescribable moments of one's life. So that's why we decided to discuss Rizwan Akhtar's poetry. And Rizwan Akhtar, I would like to tell something about Rizwan Akhtar. Rizwan Akhtar is not only our senior colleague who works as assistant professor in Institute of English Studies, University of the Punjab. He has done PhD in post-colonial literature from UK. He's a very, as far as a teacher is concerned, he's a very hardworking teacher. He's not only a good poet. I want to tell you something about his as a human being, what sort of a man he is. So, as a teacher, he is being greatly loved by his students, and as a colleague, people really want to talk and sit in his company, and his company is always enlightening. Why? Because it's not that he is a good poet, but he is a very well read man. So that's why we always appreciate his comments, his suggestions, his ideas, and not only appreciated by me or by his students, but by all of us, all the people who are there in Institute of English Studies. So we are very happy that today we are going to have this literary session in which learned people from other countries also have participated and joined us, and we will definitely benefit from their ideas and from their thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shmaila Dodhy. Just one stanza from Rizwan's poem, The End of Pandemic. When this silence will be over, poets will compensate. Till then, words depart. Love needs a pause. I'm reminded of a very beautiful essay by Virginia Woolf, Solar Eclipse, The Solar Eclipse, in which she talks about that how the sun disappears for only for 24 seconds. And in those 24 seconds, Virginia Woolf discovered that the entire world, its beauty was gone. There was darkness all around, and they had lost all hopes. But then, after 24 seconds, there was light again, and life was coming back. So, pandemic, and not only pandemic in the part of the world where we are living, actually, much earlier than pandemic, the entire Kashmir has been turned into a ghetto, into a kind of a prison. So, in this context, I think poetry has its own importance. I am really pleased to announce that today with us, Christopher Merrill is there. Christopher Merrill is a renowned American poet, essayist, journalist, a translator. He has published almost six collections, 6 volumes of his poetry has been published. Almost his poetry translated in 40 languages, and today he is kind enough to find time. At the present moment, he's working uh, as a director of international writing program at the University of Iowa. I would like to request Christopher Merrill to say a few words on Dr. Rizwan's poetry. Christopher Merrill, please. Ma- Mr. Merrill, are you there? I hope there is no breakdown of electricity in United States of America. Maybe we can wait for.
Yeah, excuse me, sir. He has rejoined. You can introduce him now, please.
Okay. We can wait. We can wait.
Sir, he is here with us now.
Thank you. Mr. Merrill, can you hear me? Is he there? Ifra, is he there?
Yes, sir. He just rejoined. He is here on the screen.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Merrill, can you hear me? I think you need to.
Can I be heard? Because
You are being heard.
Can I be heard? Because I can hear close to nothing. Please nod if you can hear me, because I can't hear anyone. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Merrill, can you?
So,
no, Aisha, you are audible. Mr. Merrill, can you hear me?
Dr. Alam, I can only tell that you were speaking, but what you were saying, I cannot. I could not hear. So I will. Would you like me?
Aisha, I will get back.
I'm afraid that I can only hear a word here and there. So,
am I the first speaker? Please nod if I am.
No, Aisha, okay. you are not the. Aisha, you are not the first speaker. It's Christopher Merrill.
I'm going to sign off because I'm afraid I can't hear anything.
Mr. Merrill, please don't sign off. Could you
don't
try
sign off?
Could you try speaking, please? We can hear you.
The problem is I can't really hear you.
All right.
I get about every third or fourth word.
Okay.
It's very frustrating.
I think you need to ask all the audience members to mute their mics. Only then will everybody be audible. Please mute your mics, everybody. Please mute your mics so that you can hear Christopher Merrill speak. Could you try now, Christopher Merrill? Could you please try now?
Yes, I can hear you. The problem is that I'm only getting words here and there because the audio is just, I guess, too
All right.
unstable.
May I suggest that since we can hear you clearly, that you go ahead with your speech and with your presentation, because we can hear you clearly. And since you're going to be speaking, it doesn't really matter whether you hear us or not.
I think I heard a little bit of that. I think I just can't hear enough. I'm gonna give you my regrets and wish you well today. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Then it is the technology that fails then. Okay. Zulfikar, can you hear us, Zulfikar?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
And I think one of the suggestions could be that if only the speaker keeps his or her camera on, perhaps that might, facilitate.
All right.
This meeting. So perhaps yeah, I could hear Dr. Merrill
Okay,
quite clearly.
we can turn off our cameras. Maybe we can turn off our.
Yeah. Perhaps if that makes it better, that is fine. If it doesn't, then we can switch on our cameras. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay. That's good. That's good. So thank you very much. So I am the speaker now, or is it Dr. Burke? Or?
Yes, you are the speaker now. Yes, you are the speaker now.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much to Institute of English Studies, Punjab University, and Dr. Alam and Dr. Akhtar, and the dean, and Dr. Dodhy for this kind invitation to speak about Professor Rizwan Akhtar's poetry. And I have written a few lines about Rizwan's recent poems. I will say a few words about his poetry in general, and then, I will focus on his connection with Lahore and one of his recent poems, Tea with Alan. And that is not to, I think that he has responded to some recent events as well in his poetry, but the poem that had really caught my attention, that was Tea with Alan. So that is why I'll be speaking about that in a little bit of detail. One of the many important functions of literature and other art forms is to preserve cultural memory. This becomes challenging when the aim is to capture one's experience in poetic form and in a language nurtured by a different tradition. Rizwan's poems offer a blend of English literary sensibilities and a rich history of his hometown, Lahore. Lahore is as great a source of inspiration for him as Dublin was for James Joyce, though there is a difference. Joyce had rarely been shy of expressing his bitterness towards Dublin and had a very complex relationship with it. Whereas Rizwan connects with Lahore in a melancholic but sensuous manner. Lahore is a city of many guises: a dear friend, a benefactor, an old relation, an object of desire, or the aging woman bound to you by the past that memory never fails to romanticize. His culture consciousness makes him painfully aware of a Lahore that is no more, and he speaks to us with a sense of loss in an inevitably nostalgic voice. His attempts to immortalize the past translates into his exploration of the landscape of Lahore, its Mughal and colonial architecture, its walled city, and perhaps most importantly, its language and its idiom that he makes his own. In some of his poems, his romance with Lahore becomes a plea, asking his readers to stop and pause to weep over the remembrance of my beloved, reminiscing like the great Arabic poet Imrul Qais, who expressed his love for the woman he once loved but never forgot. The sense of loss is strongly reflected in Another Day in Lahore, in an act of Blakean meditation when one can see a world in a grain of sand and eternity in an hour. The poem encapsulates the diversity of human experience in one moment, ranging from children running after a kite to old men coughing to overpower silence. And something very interesting that I have observed, that silence is a very dominant and a recurring theme in Rizwan's poetry, not only in the poems that he has recently shared or recently composed, but in his first collection as well, Lahore, I Am Coming. In these recent poems, in Done by Silence, Rizwan continues to explore silence, a recurring image and a theme in his poems. With precise strokes of an impressionist, he records to visceral and intended human activities, everyday existence of ordinary people whom the dominant social discourse quite conveniently ignores. Like every creative artist, Rizwan is sensitive to the questions that human condition entails, as well as conflicts and contradictions of our temporal existence. I believe everybody can hear me.
Yes, we
Zulfikar,
can
you are
hear.
perfectly audible. It's good.
Okay,
Please carry on.
Okay, because I'm not looking at the screen now as I'm reading, so I don't know if there are any messages.
It's okay.
Okay.
It's okay. It's okay.
In case there is a problem, just please let me know. Thank you.
Okay.
Like every creative artist, Rizwan is sensitive to the questions that human condition entails, as well as conflicts and contradictions of our temporal existence. Tea with Allen contemplates the conflicting relationship between the colonial past that haunts a post-colonial meeting. Despite Allen's charming grace, the derelict images which the narrator sees around their rendezvous trigger the memory of home. The seductive aura of the meeting evokes desire, the possibility of building a connection. But then it is overshadowed by the image of tea that embodies two dueling concepts: the notion of socialization in post-colonial Lahore and elsewhere in South Asia, and the colonial capitalist project. Tea has lost its medicinal use that it had in pre-colonial era, but is a part of the colonial enterprise now, losing its relationship to South Asia as the English fascination with nomenclature coins a new term for it: English breakfast tea. Ironically, the narrator laments that English language has no word to express the way Allen holds the cup. But nevertheless, it coins a term for the tea. So this connection becomes very potent and something that I've found really fascinating. That tea, I believe most of us know, or those younger people who don't know, that tea was basically, it originated in South Asia, the black tea I'm talking about. It originated in South Asia and it had a medicinal use. And even now some people use it as a medicine. So it was used as a medicinal herb. However, when East India Company came to South Asia, to India, they started using it as a product, and they had generated capital using it. So this relationship, I think that something that exists in the very title, Tea with Alan. So tea is something which is indigenous, which is native to South Asia, and then tea with Alan, Alan as a symbol or a representation of the former colonizer. Now, the tension in the poem, that there is this memory or this haunting memory of the colonial past, and then there is this aestheticization of a connection with the colonizer. So this is what I found really fascinating, and I think this is very it's brilliantly expressed when the poem tells us when Rizwan aestheticizes the very act of begging in Baker Street, and it is aestheticized because it is the act of begging is accompanied with music, with the song, whereas the other comparison we have is that of the act of begging in Lahore, which connotes misery and deprivation. And to conclude, I would just like to say that when I was reading the poem, I think it reminded me of my own experience of taking tea in those stalls when I was a student in Lahore. And I think Rizwan, in a very poignantly for me, captures this when he says that barely gratifying reminds one of how small those teacups are and how you long for more as soon as you have finished your tea. When I read this, I almost said to myself, "Yaar chai khatam hogi." And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Probably the way you have described tea, we should order a cup of tea. Thank you very much, Dr. Zulfikar Haider. We are here with us, Professor Dr. Amra Raza, Dean, Faculty of Arts and Humanities. Many of us sitting here are her colleagues, her students. I don't think she needs any introduction at all. So I would request Professor Dr. Amra Raza to please say a few words about Rizwan's poetry. Dr. Raza.
Thank you, Dr. Khurshid. Thank you, first of all, for organizing this event. I think that Dr. Rizwan's poetry has brought us all together. It's wonderful to see Dr. Zulfikar here, Dr. Aisha Bark, and thank you, Dr. Shamila, the director of the IES. Many of our students, I can see them here. So thank you for bringing us all together. I think that is the first function of poetry. Rizwan, the first collection of Rizwan was deeply rooted in Lahore. In the sense that there was a nostalgia, as Dr. Zulfikar has mentioned. Lahore was present in the back of the mind of the poems constantly. There was a lot of transcultural elements, lots of transcultural elements. In the poems that we are talking about today, although it is under the heading of the pandemic and there were at least 2 poems on the lockdown, I think that the poet has moved inwards, and it's also not only just an interior landscape he's talking about, but the exterior landscape has become very, very sensual. So there's a lot of auditory, visual, olfactory imagery. It is full of kinesthetics, and I enjoyed the fact that there was this vacillation between ing and ed verbs. So the use of inflected forms such as the past participle as well as the ing verbs. Now, to me, this signaled a lot of registering of the environment. It's almost like a thumbprint. However, whereas previously it was mostly visual, you also have now the auditory and the olfactory senses prevailing. So you have lots of verbs. You have boiled, burped, mowing, wiped, preserved, cajoling, stamped. But it's a vacillation between the ing and the ed verbs. Um, I also felt that sometimes the sentences became very long-winded, and um, I had been meaning to ask Dr. Rizwan about this because sometimes one has to catch one's breath after coming to the end of the sentence. And I thought about it, and I thought that maybe they are long-winded, indicating that the activities of the mindscapes and the landscapes are constantly melding, and the ideas and the scapes that the poet is talking about actually overtake the consciousness. That's why maybe you have these long sentences, and sometimes a poem is just comprised of 2 sentences. Uh, the transcultural element is very much there. You have tea in Bistro Baker Street, and then you have a looking back to Lahore, triggered by the visual or even a pigeon. And interestingly, in the poems that I was sent for this forum discussion, rain and birds. These are 2 major elements which Rizwan talks about. So you have birds, crows, such as crows, you have the seagulls, you have lots of mention of the word bird itself, which perhaps is a generalization also. Then you have different types of rain, fogs, rains, you have drizzles, you have these big drops also on the window panes, hanging on window panes, and even sharp needles of water. So there's a very tactile and visual observation. The images are, as I said at the beginning, very, very intense this time. And it's almost like watching life from behind a window. Maybe that is the pandemic aspect of it. Maybe that is the lockdown aspect of it. The word chai recurs again and again, and of course chai is always welcome. I think the recurrence has something to do with our maybe Pakistani or Asian conscious, as Zulfikar has also pointed out. It was a pleasure reading your poetry, Dr. Rizwan, and I think that the pandemic has taken a lot from us, but it is in art that we convert negative aspects into positive aspects, and pain can become pleasurable. So it is the platform on which we reconcile paradoxes. So I wanted to thank you, Rizwan, for providing me these poems to read. I enjoyed them thoroughly. And Dr. Alam, thank you for providing me with this space to speak about his poetry. I just want to mention one other thing, and that is that in forums where we talk about poems or poetry, I think that the man and the poet, or the woman and the poet, should be kept separate. And this is important because once the poem is on the page, it doesn't belong to the poet anymore. It has its own life. The very fact that we're talking about it in terms of our own experiences and perspectives and interpretations is validation enough of that element. Another thing, and this is the last thing I'd like to say, and that is that we have had a lot of novelists from this part of the region, and we write a lot about them. Our students do a lot of critical work on them. Uh, um, Let me take this opportunity, since there are a lot of students here, that हमेशा जो है ना पोइट्स या नॉवेलिस्ट्स या आर्टिस्ट की तारीफ जो है, मेरा ख्याल है कि तारीफ अच्छी बात है, लेकिन what is more important is a critical analysis of their work, and that is what an artist is also looking for, a true artist is looking for, rather than just praising them to high heaven. I think that we should, that's why when a poem or when a painting lives on forever, the more we talk about it, the more angles we see in it, the more perspectives it opens out to us. That is what is important, and language is the key to that. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amna Raza, for enlightening us. Before I invite the next speaker, do we have Dr. Sibghatullah here? Professor Dr. Sibghatullah from Namal here?
Yes, I am around.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Saab. Thank you for joining us. I just want you to wait for a few seconds because I want Dr. Akhtar to read any poem of his own choice. So वो जो हमारे होता है ना हमारे कल्चर में कलाम शायर बज़बान शायर, तो थोड़ा critical acclaim के दरमियान या appreciation के, let's have a break and let's listen to what poetry tells us and how poetry moves us, and इससे बेहतर क्या कि that we have the poet himself too. So maybe I would request him to either a requiem for Kashmir or any other poem maybe. Please, Dr. Rizwan Akhtar.
Okay, thank you, Khurshid. Thank you, everybody. And it's really sad that we lost Christopher Merrill anyway. And thank you very much, others, for saying things about my work. Khurshid, I am audible.
But you are audible. You are audible.
All right, all right. Since you have asked me to read a poem, which I would certainly, and I think I would read this A Requiem for Kashmir. And it is so unfortunate that we lost Christopher Merrill. Christopher Merrill and Agha Shahid Ali were very close friends for 20 years, and he could have talked about that. But this is all we have. This is a poem which is again dedicated to the memory of Agha Shahid Ali. He was from Indian Kashmir, and Agha Shahid Ali is the one who introduced actually ghazal to the American readers and to the Western audience. I do Agha Shahid Ali every year with my MPhil, hopefully, his collection of ghazals called Me Ishmael Tonight. But this is a poem which is about Kashmir. I don't live in Kashmir, but valleys Vicarous Denzian complacently weigh words, like the Irish bard Yates spreads his dreams. I'm out to hoist a color-free flag, an ancient anthem of camaraderie. I caress my mother's Kashmiri shawl and touch a burgundy carpet, an image of a subdued Mongol, hemmed with juniper flowers, sits at the center, holding a wine pitcher pouring. Being away, my descriptions are second-hand. But I have read poets praising Dal Lake, so between Shah and Ghazali, I can make way to peaks and floundering paths, pallets and protests, cloyed in haze from trees, long witnessing, hauling shells of tear gas in between soldiers, chase people running, writing verses. Of their stoned lives, each thing matters, a gun, a couplet, a requiem for Kashmir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akhtar, for reciting this wonderful poem. I would now like to invite Dr. Sibghatullah Khan. Dr. Sibghatullah is from Islamabad. He is head of the Department of English at National University of Modern Languages. His research interests are actually going beyond essentialist binary ridden and conventional theorization on literature. He is actually interested more in the nature of literature itself. So, without wasting further moments, I would request Dr. Sibtullah Khan to please say a few words on Dr. Akhtar's poetry. Dr. Sibtullah Khan, please. आप अपना डॉक्टर साहब अपना माइक चेक कीजिएगा पहले अपना.
Thank you, sir. Khurshid Alam Sahab.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm really grateful for this honor to be part of this seminar. In fact, I have always been thinking of this somehow or the other. I couldn't be part of any such privileged meeting on Rizwan Akhtar's poetry. So since today I have got the chance, I just feel privileged. I also want to make this correction that I am no more head of department. So, there is always change of hand and rotation. So I am saying this so that people keep the right kind of record, and people also don't mind that there is a mix of events. I have entitled my, my comments on Rizwan Akhtar's poetry as Willy Wonka of a poet. So I would be trying to put my ideas under this rather unconventional title. About 4 days back, when I was asked to speak on Rizwan Akhtar's poetry, I was touched on the raw, because since the publication of his first volume of poetry, Lahore, I'm Coming, I've been constantly trying to dug out of this job of critiquing Akhtar's work. The reason, doubtless, was not that it didn't stir the right kind of emotion in me as a reader. In fact, whenever I read any poem by Rizwan Akhtar, I was overwhelmed by his alchemy of form and content and his nonchalance about punctuation. For me, his poetry is a celebration of enjambment and caesura. When you are in Akhtar's poems, you are nagged by an extravaganza of run-on lines and eternally shifting caesura from its medial position in the lines. Behind Birds is a poem, for example, in spite of its beauty of the idea and economy of language, is one long sentence that opens in an exclamatory tone with an initial capital, with the absence of initial capital letter, is just one long sentence capturing the immediacy of thought, lest it should slip by. The reader is left wondering whether it is the idea that is more beautiful or the form of the poem. We are still trying to keep a hold on the way the poem moves when it ends with an epiphany that not being born with words is also a poem. Therefore, the reader of Akhtar's poetry is like Charlie Bucket in the movie Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And the poet plays Willy Wonka, surprising the reader with ever new stunners through his experimentation with language and the art of versification. That is why I always thought that critiquing Akhtar's poetry might be a very daunting job. But since I have been given the honor by the organizers of this BAITHAK to say something, I have had this compulsive pleasure an ordeal to read some great poems by Rizwan Akhtar. We, the speakers, have been given a selection of his poems published after Lahore I'm Coming. Since Rizwan Akhtar is a Pakistani Anglophone poet, there's no avoiding the post-colonial question, but he approaches it rather differently when the first person narrator, possibly the poet himself, sits and takes tea with Alan outside Baker Street. The constructions like Cyclone tea in tea tin box embossed with colonial enterprise, English breakfast tea, tea leaf in plantations withering, come cascading until the derelict beggar back in Lahore wanting gratis tea provides the post-colonial bathos after an old man sang Frank Sinatra on banjo. But the poet or his first-person alter ego in the poem, when he gives the graphic pictures of the way Ellen holds the cup and how he observed her elbow and smelled the aroma of her steamy, cherried cheeks, dilutes the sense of post-colonial revenge or apathy by playing a kind of lover who thought as if she was a tea wave wanting a tempest, drowning him on the coast. The fast-moving kaleidoscope of images in the poem, coupled with the volcanic speed of run-on lines, leaves the reader breathless at the end. And the only three periods in the poem hardly compensate for it. In fact, I am very particular about the use of punctuation when I read poetry in classes at all levels. I try to make it a point that, if you lose track of punctuation in a poem, you are probably in for a trouble, because it might not that easily be possible for you to get the idea of the poem, or at least its effect. For example, when I teach Maya Angelou's woman work, the first 12 lines have got only one period at the end, and we try to explain it to the students that since Maya Angelou was trying to list up the household chores of a third world woman or an Afro-American woman, and those chores come one after the other without any pause, and that is what the life of an Afro-American woman is like. So there's no need of punctuation, and the reader is breathless when the reader reads the poem. That is why when I see almost the entire poetry of Rizwan Akhtar without any punctuation, I'm impelled to think that probably he has got some idea behind this, because I have to read it, panting for my breath if I am a good reader of his poetry. But since I don't find any punctuation whatsoever, except a few, of course, there are certain commas, certain periods at places. So I am always running out of breath when I read Rizwan Akhtar's poems. In fact, I might be able to, I was looking for this kind of poetry which is done without punctuation. If it is representative of the human emotions or human feelings, or how or why the human or how the human beings socialize or interact with one another, if it is like a kind of dialogue with the readers, punctuation becomes a kind of lead into how the poem should be read out. But since there is this discouraging lack of punctuation in Rizwan Akhtar's poetry, I always try to invent ways as to where to pause. Like when I was listening to Rizwan Akhtar, when he was reading out a requiem for Kashmir, I was happy that he was taking pauses and he was not out of breath when he was reading his poem. Though the punctuation has not been used the way it has been used, or the way it is used by most of the poets, but since he has got very convincing reasons for not using punctuation, uh, no. But I, as a reader, when I read his poems, whether it is Lahore I am coming or the poems that I have been given now, uh, I tried to make my own punctuation, and that is why Rizwan Akhtar's poetry is not reader friendly in a way, because you have to choose for yourself as to where you're supposed to stop and take a pause so that you make sense of the idea. And if this caesura is shifting constantly, and if the run-on lines are coming like a volcano, I mean, you have to make the sense of things yourself. But since it is not reader friendly, and you are kind of paranoid when you are reading his poems just to make some sense of it, you have to be really, really very smart. And that is where Rizwan Akhtar, in fact, is investing, that he's addressing 21st century readers who have already been fed on this paranoia of reading, and who have already been nourished on reading non-linear scripts and non-linear texts. I think he might be smugly very right for not using punctuation. So I'm sorry I made a comment like this, but it was kind of troublesome for me if I had held it down. Okay, while reading Akhtar's poems, I was struck by the idea how difficult it becomes to read cultural poetry in Ricardian fashion. Uh, for students, I can explain here that by Ricardian I mean the way I.A. Richards in early 20th century liberal humanist times tried to make his students interpret poems without giving them the luxury of the poets' names. Rizwan Akhtar's poetry is largely soaked in culture and cultural memories, though there are exceptions also where Rizwan waxes cosmopolitan. A close reading of cultural poems in I.A. Richards' style is a no-no affair, at least here. This seminar, for example, is not for the liberal humanists, where everyone knows the poet. Uh, it is not for the liberal humanists, where everyone knows the poet and is trying to read his poetry with reference to his location and personal life experiences. I, Dr. Amra was referring to the same thing, uh, that we need to keep the poet and the narrator or the persona in the poem in their respective places. Maybe it makes sense in that context. I felt like asking Rizwan Akhtar about his experiences at University of Essex, but I stopped short of doing that because I wanted to sound objective in my analysis of his poetry, which I probably cannot. When we read poems like Another Day in Lahore, we are in for refreshing local cultural experience when boys are on a run for kites and old men on charpoys gurgle language made for climax of everything except silence. And I.A. Richards might well have thought of echoing green, echoing a universal human scene, good for all times, but we have our own poets talking to us. An Odyssey of Lahore romance is again like a cultural metaphor spread across 24 lines in the mode of a ghazal. Maybe this is not good for all of his poems, but the poems that we were given this time, these 12 poems, surprisingly, I spotted this thing, that Rizwan Akhtar has made a creative and poetical, use of self-isolation in two poems on pandemic. Since pandemic is like topical, something topical, So he has made a very creative and poetical use of self-isolation in two poems on pandemic. What he wants to put across to audience in the end of pandemic and in times of self-isolation is that poets and artists can make the best out of the worst and bring hope when frustration stares you in the face. Poets will compensate, as he writes, and the written words will return, provide a kind of emotional anchorage in the times of loneliness and anxiety. Uh, this next idea was especially very striking for me. I was particularly struck by Rizwan Akhtar's obsession with the idea of silence. You know, he mentions, as Dr. Amra was saying, he mentions birds, rain, but he mentions silence everywhere. Under one, I mean, in the poems that we were given, under one or the other excuse, he brings in silence. In Behind Birds is a poem. The first line reads, "How birds choose to break the silence." In times of self-isolation, where language makes a lot of sense of silence, in some birds, uproot the system of silence. In the other side of lockdown, climax of everything except silence. And in the title, placard says silence is violence, its political importance apart. Rizwan Akhtar might be done with silence because he seems to be crusading against silencing. That is how we probably are supposed to read it. Uh, and since we do not have that much of time, uh, dear audience, Rizwan Akhtar's poetry carries as many shades of human experience as possible. We might be justly proud of Tawfiq Rafat, Dawood Kamal, Kalim Umar, and Alamgir Hashmi, and our contemporary poets, many of them young still, but we have been taken unawares by Rizwan Akhtar, and we have graduated to him because of the sheer power of his ideas, his play of language, and his knack for surprises. He's our Willy Wonka. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sibughatullah. We have received a message from Christopher Merrill, and he has written few words, and he wants me to read these words in this forum. Merrill says that the pandemic has enforced varying degrees of isolation upon us all, and my inability to hear what was being said in the discussion of Dr. Akhtar's poems written during lockdown is emblematic of the very ways in which we have lost contact with what is essential to the human condition: the possibility to communicate from one solitude to another. This is, of course, what poetry does, and I'm grateful for Dr. Akhtar's determination to sing through the pandemic, reminding us that we live between two forms of silence, which oblige us to discover the meaning of our walk in the sun. What good luck it is then to read about what Dr. Akhtar has learned in this cruel time. If it is true, as he writes, that the end is certainly open-ended, and I'm glad to imagine the possibility of hearing him sing about that forever. Statement from Christopher Merrill. Thank you very much, Christopher Merrill, for at least sending us the statement. Now, I just want to know that if our colleague Aisha Burke is there. Can I hear Aisha Burke? Ifra, can you spot her? Aisha, am I audible? Aisha, please turn on your mic.
No, ma'am. You have to unmute yourself.
No, no, no. Nobody has muted you. Unmute yourself. Like Hamlet says, unhand me, gentlemen.
Ma'am, there's an icon on the bottom left corner. If you can see it, and you can just click it, please.
Aisha, maybe you can. Can you hear me, Aisha? Okay. So maybe one thing you can do is that you sign off and then sign in again. Maybe then it will work. I hope it will work then. Okay. By the time we could catch up Aisha, maybe we can invite the poet to please read any poem of his own choice from the collections that he has shared with his audience. Dr. Akhtar?
Okay, okay, Khurshid. Just give me a moment. Since some of the speakers were talking about the cultural element, uh, I think that I would look at this poem, which runs an epigraph to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, An Odyssey of Lahore's Romance. Khurshid, am I audible?
You are audible.
All
Perfectly
right.
audible.
I'm reading this piece, which is the last one in this file. Love in this part of world has its own fate of killing time through words in neighborhood. Language at disposal is a menial servant, edging in and out of kitchen, cleaning dishes and cutlery. See, there is a background noise. Someone's mic
I
is.
would I, I would request all the participants to please turn off their mics. For the moment when he's reading his poem, please turn off your mics.
Okay,
Here is one, sir.
all right, I'm trying again. An Odyssey of Lahore's Romance. Love in this part of world has its own fate of killing time through words in neighborhood. Language at disposal is a menial servant hedging in and out of kitchen, cleaning dishes and cutlery. There is a gaze that forks through windows frankly into rooms hushed by clandestine verbs on pallets. Elbows brush, faces puff, pomegranate blushing, while under furry blankets sentences ebb and flow. You huddled like a gazelle in a corner and waited for a makta I chewed under a tongue stained by beetle leaf. The wasting din of Lahore's vehicles and footsteps came on a menacing pace separating our embrace, wanting to continue like a gramophone plays a decadent tune of a nabob sprawled on a divan with velvety bolsters. However, now we are like two cracked pitchers whose receding surfaces ooze a forbidden wine. The chai rituals of old days are layered by dust on hands, opening cupboards like museums of aromatic relics. There is also an old manuscript that smells like your lips, lending a casual touch to those protruded peaks of breasts. Sent shivers in my bones after the door stopped showing, your tresses dancing crazily on your sweating back. Since then, the couplets have fudged in an attempt to contain the scandal looking for a sacred closure, an odyssey of Lahore's romance.
Thank you very much for uh, reading the poem. Aisha, am I audible to you now?
Okay, I
Oh,
can't hear
thanks.
anyone, but can I? Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
So
then
go ahead.
I'll
Go
just
ahead.
speak and do pardon me because I didn't I wasn't able to hear most of the session, but I was rewarded briefly for my tenacity because I got a part of Dr. Sibgatullah's speech where he was talking about punctuation uh, and the kind of deluge of imagery that that's characteristic of Rizwan's verse. So I might be repeating things, and if I am, just please stop me with a nod or a wave. Dr. Alam, please, since you're the only one I can see on my screen. I've even missed the poet himself. Um, so I'll just say a few things because I don't want to repeat stuff. As I've already told you, I missed most of what was said. Can't hear it. All right. So as far as Dr. Sibgatullah's comment on location was concerned, and I'm particularly thinking of the poem "The Other Side of Lockdown." Yes, Rizwan's verse does frequently resist location, and there are ways and ways that he does it. And at the moment, I have just this one piece as a sample of how he does it. Where he's talking about these. The woman with the flowers in the water pot in the window, and then the hinges, and how she hears, and how he's on the outside of the building, and then there's the creak of the hinges of the cupboard inside, and then the cigars come out, and the incongruity between the rest of the setting and an object like cigars. And then later on, he moves from the urban environment to the village, where he's talking about taking care of lands and of cattle left to graze without much intervention of grass is thicker, more is waiting time to reap our silence. Very reminiscent of Larkin's 1914, and also connecting thematically with it, since it's the other side of lockdown. But here, the urban and the rural, the eastern and the western, these come together, and that is just one of the ways in which he resists location. So it's not always very easy to pin him down. And then being a post-colonial writer, and being very conscious of the experience of post-coloniality, we see that his poems kind of make these quick transitions between the present, the moment of writing, it seems, or the moment of what he's describing, and then the moment of memory, and which is not always personal memory; it can be historical memory, which is almost characteristic of post-colonial writing. So that much for the location. Another thing that I would like to talk about, I hope it hasn't been talked about earlier in the session. So that is his the tension in his work, constant tension in his work, and it's there in Lahore I'm Coming as well, between language, silence, gesture, post-coloniality, desire, sexuality, these, and somehow desire and language get intertwined. and they become these two factors become the hotbed, the germinating reservoir for his work. And I will refer here to this poem, and just let me turn to it, please, in a moment. Yes, Behind Birds is a poem. And I thought both in its title, there was so much of the thought fox, the idea of the thought fox, Ted Hughes's thought fox, how a poem is concealed. And here he says, Behind Birds is a poem. Look, mind you, there is a poem. And it's almost like, you don't recognize it. You don't recognize poetry as I see it. It's another kind of ball game that I'm playing, and that is what Dr. Sibghatullah was also talking about. It's a ball game of images, which engender each other. This short poem, I'll read it. How birds choose to break the silence, dropping from leaves of trees, themselves so alone, like unfinished sentences, trapped in a stasis of a fantasy, unable to make its way, and just chirp to themselves, which in the case of others in insanity, certainly, a theme. So they chirp a theme that keeps them going unafraid. And I thought that was so characteristic of the kind of work that Rizwan is doing, where his poetry is language, but it is also defying language constantly. As Dr. Sibghatullah again pointed out, and I refer to his section because that's the little bit that I got. There is defiance of syntax. There is defiance of punctuation. There is the desire in the poem to liberate itself from the shackles of the Eurocentric construction, linguistic construction that that is also the tradition that he writes in, and hence the presence of the ghazal as well. There in the tension of the Eurocentric tradition of poetry coming into combat with local experience, which he has made rich use of in his poetry. And that way I thought, where he ends this poem, and he's talking about the chirp, and he says, not being born with words is also a poem. And as if, kind of ratifying silence, validating silence, and kind of sitting on the fence with that paradox, which is persistent in his poetry, between silence and language. And he says in one of his poems later in the collection, and it has been just quoted a little while back, where language still makes a lot of sense of silence. So it's like language. The poem is an attempt at negotiating the local desire, the personal desire, the sexual desire, with the prescribed syntax and the inherited forms of Western poetry. And he's, of course, like Derek Walcott, the two-headed Janus, coming from both the cultures. And I'm sure there isn't that much time. I'll quickly jump on to the pandemic poems, and they're beautiful in the sense that they've captured the kind of reflective hiatus in desire itself that COVID brought to the world. That how desire and life itself was terminated by COVID, and time was put into a time capsule and incubated somewhat. And he and I think this kind of E.E. Cummings sort of stanza from the end of Pandemic is really onomatopoeic of it, where he says, whatever lost, meanwhile, is kept in mind's microchip, but bodies went to graveyards. Memory is a dug-up hole. Beeping monitors rest, comes another. And this is like, the kind of disjunction that COVID brought into our lives is really the blueprint of this verse, and it's there in its form, and in the in the almost total breakdown of life itself in the poem. And from here, I go on to the last poem, which captivated me particularly. Um, Although Some Birds is just like a delicious piece. It reminds me of his earlier poem Chapati, which I'm very fond of also, which is just it's a description, of things. It doesn't attempt to say anything beyond what it actually says. All the buzzing noise has gone. Am I still audible? Okay, all right. So I move on to An Odyssey of Lahore's Romance. And just to give you a sample of how I feel he creates this ambiguity in his verse, as Dr. Sabgutullah pointed out, that I'm glad that he stops and pauses when he reads. Otherwise, it's like a taxi, an engine of a taxi waiting, panting. But not in this poem, but in many of his other poems, there is this almost panting sense of the image sequence just spilling on one image spilling onto another image. But in that, A, there is this defiance of syntax and punctuation, and B, there is this semantic tussle going on. It's almost as if he's saying, my poem will not follow orders. I'll just read these two lines to you. Love in this part of world has its own fate of killing time through words in neighborhood. Now, in the neighborhood, our neighborhood, in words in neighborhood with each other, you don't know. And he leaves it open. This open-endedness, which is also the last line of one of his poems that we are reading today, is this open-endedness that contributes then to this ambiguity. And then he goes on to say, language at disposal is a menial servant, hedging in and out of kitchen, cleaning dishes and cutlery. Now, language at disposal, whose disposal? So you don't see an authority figure. You see language as a tool which works, and you get a sense of these words in a scurry, possibly in a scullery somewhere, and it's. But there's no authoritative, cohesive force that is tying it down, and that is how love and language are. And I think when we look at these two stanzas, we kind of understand how he is operating in much of his verse. And I will conclude with this stanza. It's the last stanza of this poem, where he says, since then, the couplets have fudged in an attempt to contain the scandal, looking for a sacred closure. And this whole idea of fudging, of evading, romancing, dodging, is something that we find constantly in his work. This dodging between desire and syntax, between language and silence, and the desire, the attempt to reconcile the two somewhere beyond the page almost, so that the poem is made in silence somehow. It's the pregnant silence of his work that kind of invites us constantly into his poetry. So you have these two lines are very telling of the current of unsublimated desire in his work, which is seeking to articulate itself somehow beyond the body, in some sublime space, and yet being tied to the body and the rhythms and the sensuality and the sensuousness of its environment. I think I should stop here. Much else must already be said, which I have missed. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Aisha. I don't know whether you are able to listen to my note of thank, but somehow, thank you very, very much. I would request all the participants to please turn off their mics because then the quality will be improved. Before I open the house for discussion and for question answer session that you can talk to the poet himself and he would answer your questions. Uh, I would like to say a few things about this whole idea of organizing this and about this his poetry. When I have read many of his poems and also when I read these poems, I was reminded of T.S. Eliot, who once said that modern literature cannot be culinary. It's not kind of a literature that you eat, you enjoy, and you throw it away. I think you need to put an effort to understand modern literature and modern poetry. Modern poetry being far more difficult to understand, and in Akhtar's poetry, I have found this thing that I have to make good mental effort to understand what poet says. I mean, I would say it's almost sinful to ask the poet to explain his poem. Once the poem is on the page, it's in the public domain, and then everybody can talk about this. But what I find in his poem, something very difficult to deal with is the way he uses language and extending Dr. Sabitullah Khan's argument that you have to take a breath, you have to punctuate yourself, you have to decide where to stop and when to move, and when you move you come back and then you revise your understanding, then you go on. So I think here I found that very idea of that it's not culinary, it's not that way digestible. So I have to struggle to deal with, and poetry being uh, kind of a very difficult genre to understand or to appreciate. This is what I feel. Uh, One more thing that we have poems that deal with is isolation. Rizwan is a poet uh, living in a room, uh, passing through pandemic times. But at the same time, that isolation does connect him. That isolation does connect him to the kind of political violence that we see around. Maybe pandemic or staying at home for 14 days or 21 days. Maybe it made him feel that how maybe the Kashmiri people or how people anywhere in the world who are victims of violence, they don't have voices, they cannot express what they want to say, they are passing through certain traumas and world is not listening to them. Even if Trump comes there, he wouldn't say a single word about the people, and uh, it's very difficult to kind of deal with that situation for the poet. uh, so we have poems that deal with uh, individual subjectivity, we have poems which deal with collective human consciousness, and we have poems which are actually rooted in the indigenous cultural consciousness. Uh, uh, I would open the forum by first putting my question that when I read this poem done by silence, in one room two women kept talking, and then the poem, we have the full stop at the end of the poem, so it's maybe one sentence being expanded or so I would like Dr. Akhtar to comment on the use of language. Uh, how does he use language, or why this kind of form he has selected? So this is my first question, and then maybe for another half an hour we would request the participants to raise their questions. But till then, please, all of you, keep your mics off so we can hear one person clearly. Dr. Akhtar, please.
Right. I think it's always very difficult for a writer to comment on his own work, and that is why some of valuable people are here to talk about. Uh, I think since Khurshid has mentioned Eliot and perhaps Dr. Sidbutullah mentioned I.A. Richards, I guess. I mean, if you see, look at Eliot, I mean, Eliot was the one who said about modern poetry that it should be complex. Now, what was the complexity of the times when Eliot said this is one thing and complexity as a philosophical idea is another thing? I think it's not good. Perhaps it's little unfair to straitjacket writers. It's little unfair to tell that they have this and they don't have this. But that's what actually criticism is. In fact, that where they are strong and where they are weak. But I think poetry, since the day it discovers you, you don't bother about these things. In fact, I said, and I repeat that it's the sheer language it's the sheer player of the language that, at least for me, I mean, this is something that drives me. It drives the writer crazy, actually, when you see that how a word overwhelms you, and after you are overwhelmed by a word, I mean, its sonorous effect, its shape perhaps also on the page, and whatever the word actually brings into your mind. I mean, because the words create concrete images in your mind. You can hardly deny that, even if you're not a creative writer. So I think that language is something that that brings you to poetry. And as Dr. Sibgat and they talked about the silence, you see, they use the word obsessed, perhaps academically correct, that a writer, because if you see in the classical sense, poets, writers, they have always been people perhaps who are trying to who are trying to make us understand about the value of silence. Actually, I mean, if you go back to the idea of the book of Genesis, say in the beginning there was what? Darkness. So in the beginning there was silence, actually. So who else but God understood the meaning of silence? And if somebody says that writers, just like Shelley says, the unacknowledged legislators of the world, or diviners, or whatever euphemism you can use, I think, then perhaps they are the one who are more concerned about the value of silence, actually. And again, as I said, the complexity, Eliot was negotiating with his times because he was also credited somebody who's a pro-establishment writer. I mean, Eliot never condemned empire. Actually, he never said that empire is bad. In fact, he always wished, and he had that nostalgia for the empire and all that Western civilization holds out to him. So I think that there are so many things, working in a writer's mind when he's writing. And I think language being the first thing. I think Auden also said that about somewhere in his essay, that it's the language that the poet, first of all, is really in love with. So I think that I hope I answered what Khurshid has asked me.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm not in favor of asking questions from the writers themselves, but this is something that actually intrigued me. Ifra can help us in making a queue for the people who want to raise their hands and who want to ask some questions. Maybe Reed Shahid has raised her hands many a time, so Ifra, allow Reed Shahid to ask question, and then Sophia, and then few other questions we can take, because we don't have that much time, maybe. So we can begin with the Reed Shahid.
Hello, I would like to first of all thank you for organizing this wonderful session. It was a great delight to be able to finally listen to the poet himself talk about the poetry, because we did study some of the poems in our MPhil by Dr. Khurshid Alam, and it was a treat. And I have a question in mind because whenever I read the poetry, there was this element of exile that I found in most of the poems. I don't know if it was deliberate or it was my own sort of consciousness or mindset that found it. And sometimes it looked as if it's a political one, and the other times it I found it as sort of uh, a post-colonial mindset reading a poem, because English not being our native language, maybe that gives us a hint of exile automatically when we are reading a poem in English. So I just wanted to ask if it was just my personal response to it, or was it there in your mind as well while writing it? Because even when I looked at the nature that was defined in your poetry, there was a lot of exile in it. So I just wanted you to talk about it, and how was it for you when you wrote it? Thank you.
So this is a question in which you're asking about the idea of exile.
Yes, the theme of exile. Is it an exile from language, or she thinks that it's an exile because
If you
she
look at the
feel distance from language?
if you see at the whole notion of exile, if you historicize it, if you see the history of exile, perhaps you will agree with me that exile is a human condition actually, and one can hardly do away with that. And one way or the other, everyone experiences that. It's another thing that some people do not register, that some people experience it physically as the very idea of migration, or to be a refugee for different reasons, or to be an immigrant, as Heaney calls himself too. That a writer is perhaps one who is in a kind of a state of exile, because when you look around, you don't find familiarity. When you look around, you do not find familiarity. You feel the sense of estrangement, in fact, And unless and until you do not have that feeling, you cannot create. So in a way, if this sounds not elitist, I'm sorry, you really have to separate yourself. It's not like that you become, it's not that you're a crowd hater. It's that you just separate yourself, and then you ponder and think. But again, you think about those people from whom you have separated actually, so you are never separated in a sense. So exile is something which you can also say is a human condition in an existentialist sense. I mean and it's not simply that it's the geographical dislocation. It's the it's the agony of being in a state of affairs, in fact, or which you feel at times quite helpless. This may be a political condition, this may be a social curse, or this may be any sort of an individual you know trauma, as pandemic has turned out to be a trauma, both an individual and on the more international level. So I think that unless you do not appreciate the exile, uh, you cannot appreciate life's you know diversity. It's magnificent landscape. It's uh, and I think that to be in a state of exile is actually creative, in fact. I hope I answered that.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much,
Uh,
Ali Chahid. Now we have Sophia Humayun.
yes.
Yes. Sophia, you can go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to thank you so much for allowing me to part of this wonderful BAITHAK or a wonderful meeting. I was a huge fan of Dr. Akhtar when he was my teacher, and as a poet, he inspires me quite a lot. I cannot help saying that. Regarding his poetry, it's wonderful. I love the imagery, and but there's one thing that pinches me, perhaps my personal point of view. I find a persistent presence of women in your poetry, Dr. Akhtar, and women in different roles. They are powerful women, but they remain quiet. Do you consciously keep them quiet, like if I compared Tawfiq Rafat's poem on Wedding in the Blood and with your poem on Bride. They both remain quiet and their context has evolved. Contextually, if we look at the context of the both of Brides, it has evolved. But where is the evolution of women in Pakistani society over the decades? And when when this poem ends and you wrote this last line that she keeps on waiting, that was really intriguing. It kept me thinking about it for so many days. So I would like to have your opinion on this whole state.
All right. I I don't know if there is any poet of the world who has not written on women, or any writer who has not written on women. So even if there is a persistent presence of women in a poet, it's perfectly natural, it's perfectly human, it's perfectly perfect actually. That's what my understanding is. And if you just contextualize it, that we are brought up in a culture where Urdu poetry, and specifically ghazal, it means talking to women. But that's just a one thing, actually. I mean, but if I'm not wrong, you said that these women are not empowered women, perhaps, if I'm not wrong.
No, I said they powerful.
They're
The
powerful.
description is
The other
but
way,
they
the
don't
other way.
speak. Their
Sorry?
voice is they are powerful. Just like you gave a reference to Anarkali, she was a powerful lady, and
Mm,
other women as well. But where is their voice?
yeah. Well, I can't really answer that question, where is their voice? And I mean, it's a little complicated actually, that how you understand the idea of woman actually in poetry. It's not something that every time a woman stands for, a woman actually. Just like in ghazal, you see a woman not always stands for beloved. And this again reminds me of Agha Shahid Ali poems Tonight, which I've recently taught. It's a ghazal in English, in which he talks about Kashmir as his beloved. And he says in the ghazal that why should I adore myself if my beloved is not close to me? Now here comes this idea of exile also, that I'm away from Kashmir, and why should I adore myself? Why should I wear new dress because my beloved is away? So the very idea of a woman, I think, in poetry is something that can be very that can be very, deceptive, perhaps elusive, and uh, I exactly do not know how to, pin it down, but I think that I am definitely impressed. I'm not impressed because if you imbibe or read literature of your region, the very idea of the woman, sometimes you find, something that is irresistible actually, and you find a lot behind that. There's a lot behind the image of the woman actually. I mean, for example, very briefly, there is also a poem Two Women, which apparently looks like as if this is a poem which is about, you know, homosexuality. And there is a reference to Adrian Rich in the poem also, and Black perhaps. But it is not so, in fact. So there is much more than simply a woman. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akhtar. Thank you, Sophia Mayum. Now we have Urana Bashir with us. Urana?
Okay, so am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so first of all, thanks to all the speakers for giving this insightful talk. Dr. Rizwan, my question is, you have talked about the moment of epiphany and what makes poetry happen. I would like to ask what keeps this going and what is that motivation behind? We are having these poems coming after one another. And Dr. Khurshid, the way he has commented that pandemic, lockdown may have made you feel how people deal with isolation and traumas and silence and all these subjects. But also, you yourself have commented that on the use of language and how language is a sheer source of pleasure for you. My question is, what helps you deal with this complex subject of language, and how do you find pleasure in dealing with this complexity? From the complexity, I mean the language. That is itself a very complex subject.
Well, it's little, once again, it's becoming more complex actually to talk about this. Uh, there is a character in Julian Bond's novel, The Sense of Ending. He says that This was another of our fears, that life wouldn't turn out to be like literature. I think most of the time what we think about is that life is like literature, yes and no, both ways. And this complexity question that is surfacing again and again here is that all of us have a very subjective idea of complexity, first thing first. I mean, what may be complex for me may not be complex for another person, and vice versa. So motivation question is, yes, I mean, there is always, just like you referred, this pandemic, yes, and Christopher has said that in his statement, that if these things happen around you, I mean, whatever they are, good or bad, like pandemic, we have certainly realized the value of, the value of human life, the value of living together, the value of family, and much more. So as long as these events keep happening, we keep responding to them. I mean, it's very simple. You just respond to them. A writer, whatever he finds, you see, appropriate, or I think he responds. So I think it's a human thing to do, to respond. It's just like say, thank you very much. I hope that answers.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar. Thank you, Orana. Now, moving ahead, we have either Sakina Heather with us. She has raised her hand. Sakina, now you can ask your question. Sakina, are you here with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, you are audible.
Why the poet expected to take punctuation along with ideas? Why aren't his ideas and flow of emotions enough? I know people will say that punctuation is important, but is it more important than the expression of idea? Is it more important or not?
No, Sakina, is it a comment or it's a question?
Yeah.
It's a question. It's a question.
It's more
We
of a
poets are
comment.
expected. We poets are expected to take punctuation seriously. Like our poetic license isn't appreciated as much as it should be.
Nobody's stopping the poet from doing whatever he wants to do with language. It is actually when the participants and the critics raise this question, maybe it was actually the kind of difficulty that the reader finds when reading that poem. But all right, maybe Dr. Akhtar can answer this question.
Yeah, it's still, if you're saying just like Dr. Sibghatullah mentioned some of the stylistic feature of the work, which is just past literary activity. When you scan a poem, these things come across you, and they are part and parcel of a poem. But a poem holds out a lot. In fact, we just can't confine ourselves to some of the things and just don't look at other things. So I think that there is so much in. I mean, it's just like that. A poem never finishes, you see, and you keep coming back to it, and you find that maybe sometimes you need a punctuation or whatever you call it, and sometimes you don't need it. I mean, it's so uncertain and at the same time impulsive, because the subject that you have chosen to write, as Aisha used this word, liberate yourself from the shackles, because language in itself is a shackle if you try to understand that. And we try to break that shackle in effort to create another language, a language which is perhaps, less shackled, or which perhaps free us.
Like the way we mix up our vocabulary, like we use our words, cultural words in English, so
Yeah,
that
yeah. You sometimes
we
feel
have
that there is you can't you don't have any replacement for a word that is uh, that is very much in your culture, and so many writers from this part of the world, they do that.
Yes, sir, I got it.
Thank you very much for the question answer session. At the end, I would like to invite, or I would like to actually request Dr. Akhtar to read one more poem in the last for us.
Okay.
And then, is Reed Shahid there? Reed, are you there?
Yes, yes, sir, I'm here.
Okay, she will conclude the session by reading a poem because she requested me that I want to read a poem by Dr. Akhtar. So before we end the session, Dr. Akhtar, please read a poem for us.
Okay. Right. So since we were talking about pandemic, and so I will now choose a poem which relates to the to the happenings of more recent times, the other side of lockdown. The other side of lockdown. On a tract of curtailed growth, a few crows hatched a conference, brandishing noise. As the only privilege they are born, apart from spooking an occasional daytime walker, who utters each word with the care to ensure flowers live in a water pot kept by a woman, bent on a window after peering in street as many times as she could, but not even the dying dirge of a vegetable vendor, not the squeaking hinges of a cupboard in which an old man keeps his pack of cigars, sent by yet another loner, making his life in a country where metropolitan police now sing songs to keep people aware of the idea of audience. Sooner there would be successors of this stage, taking care of lands and of cattle left to graze. Without much intervention, the grass is thicker. More is waiting, time to reap our silence, the other side of lockdown.
Well, at times it seems very interesting and paradoxical for me that poetry needs language. You need words, syntax, and you need uh, something on the printed to print on the page. But at the same time, there is a strange obsession with silence, with the absence of language. So this is something really interesting and also intriguing for me because less of the language and more of silence that we have here. Arij, you are the last one to read a poem of your choice. So
Yes,
please
sir.
go ahead.
I would like to read The Dancing Courtesans of Old Lahore. It is one of my most favorite poems from the collection. It is the first one in the collection, and I really
Okay,
like the the theme that of leaving the history
go ahead.
behind.
Go ahead.
The Dancing Courtesans of Old Lahore. There are noises in dark rooms. Who can build a house without din? Wooden stairs without creaking and a veranda without creepers. Crookedly ajar doors scandalize. Ghazals escape gramophone like a royal, and aging Rakasa shows up on a murky balcony. Arabesque alleys continue under brass massage hibernate. Ogling in the dancing girls' bazaar, night reveal in sitar and anklets. Hennaed feet, agile dancers exude intricate bodily expressions. Those who lack skills are desires growing on audience. Body encores mystical whirls, asking fresh piece of bitter leaf. Poems in courtesans' hands endure a legitimate munch. Over rickshaws and donkey carts, a dim moon smudges the songs, sung by the concubine Anarkali, planted alive in bricks by the emperor. Azan from the royal mosque tempers, sweating bodies. Ablutions flow on white palms. Pigeons land like souls wanting modest bribes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Arij. Let me take this opportunity to thank, first of all, Dr. Akhtar for providing such a wonderful evening by his company He read her poems. He commented upon them, and in this world which is now in the grip of pandemic and so many things, it was, I mean, recalling Nietzsche that it poetry or and art heals. I would like to take this opportunity to thank, first of all, Dean, Faculty of Arts and Humanities, Dr. Amra Raza, who was there to comment, then our director, Dr. Shamila Dodhy, and very, very special thanks to Dr. Sibutullah Khan, Dr. Zulfikar Haider, and our colleague Aisha Burke, and all our students who are there uh, in this seminar or in this session, and uh, who participated, who enjoyed poetry, and who actually make us feel proud that these students are also a poetic text for us, and we really take great pride the way they make comments and the way they come for the first day and then they start talking about poetry now. Thank you all very much. It was a wonderful evening. We are really honored. Thank you very much. The office.
The office. Thank you very much all.
Thank you.